The Golden Age of Psychopathy. Mass Predation of an Abulic Modern Society. Part 1. Introduction to a Psychopathic Golden Age. Instilled within every naturally evolving human being is a seed of divine potential. It is only through personal acts of individual will that each seed can be germinated and fully nourished to bear the fruits of higher, holistic consciousness. The goal of a predatory ruling class has long been to discourage the self-discovery of this inner potential by tactfully crafting the environment of conflict and distraction that we call modern civilization. These predatory rulers now enjoy the height of their dark prosperity, for a holistic assessment of modern civilization reveals that ignorance and naivety abound in a climate maximized for social predation. A near full-spectrum dominance has now been asserted over an abulic or weak-willed humanity and unchallenged proliferation of psychopathic urges. The spiritual and indeed hereditary disease of human consciousness, known as primary psychopathy, is typified by a total absence of empathy or remorse for often malicious and manipulative behavior. Although this rare genetic condition can be found within all strata of society, psychopathy proves to be endemic among the highest-ranking members of the ruling class, as an evaluation of their collective behavior indeed epitomizes acutely psychopathic tendencies. History clearly reveals the psychopathic whims of a predatory rulership to have long haunted mankind in an ancient and ever-fluctuating struggle, eventually delivering an amnesiac modern man into the welcoming arms of the brave new world we suffer today. The dynamic state of collective human consciousness is dependent in part upon the spiraling energies of higher cosmic time, for just as man sleeps in the darkness of each night, so too do the higher faculties of his consciousness ebb and flow between states of activation and dormancy, as human awareness is naturally synchronized to the slower rhythms of the ages. It is in such shadowed times of deep prolonged slumber that it becomes possible for the darkness within man to hold sway over the higher aspects of himself. A time when the coldest and darkest of human beings gain access to sacred knowledge not earned by their own volition, and indeed weaponize such knowledge for their own advantage. We find ourselves today in the latter culminations of such a time, for a long slumbering humanity has slowly allowed the darker hearts within man to organize and gain dominion over a dim-witted and inflated human populace. Yet the tides of power are forever in flux, and now is also a time when a new morning's light begins to peak the horizon, as older forces return and bravely attempt to rouse a sleeping world from within. This restoration of universal balance is inevitable. It is how such will happen that remains to be seen. Many times before have the mighty dark civilizations of our past been swiftly erased from the surface of this planet through cataclysmic upheavals of intense trauma and pain, just as many times as man has chosen to disavow the higher will within himself and refuse to face his own darkness. Human beings are indeed the sacred custodians of this world, and will continue to share a cooperative role alongside the laws of nature in the ongoing drama of planet Earth's living story. If man should refuse yet again to summon his own divine volition, and fail to rid himself of that which so obviously plagues him, then it is certain that the immutable laws of nature will quite unpleasantly cleanse the planet's surface of current human progress, and begin these elementary lessons in spiritual ascendancy once again. Indeed, now is the critical time when man must rise and reclaim what is rightfully his, for the predatory rulership have now implemented a monstrous system that supremely facilitates the perverted, carnal desires of their diseased consciousness, in a psychopathic infection that now spreads through all facets of society and threatens to stifle the last remnants of divine freedom within human beings. Primed for the Illuminist Sorcerer, as well as the Breakaway Technocrat, today's world bears witness to a golden age of psychopathy. When exploring such a dark reality, it is essential to maintain a balanced, holistic perspective. Strong intellect, intuition, and volition are all required in equal measure, for careless ventures into the labyrinthine depths of shadow can fast become disorienting and disempowering. Mapping negative polarity and illuminating shadow are nonetheless essential enterprises of the ascendant human journey, for it is through one's contact with the extreme polarities of contemporary earthly living that helps to inspire the evolution of human consciousness. In our world, emanations of beauty, purity, and love curiously exist alongside the darker, more fractured forms of pain, inauthenticity, and indeed wickedness. Both extremes are here to be witnessed and experienced through a direct, living contact. In so long as a state of personal impeccability is maintained, it is through our coming to know the relationship between light and shadow that we gain a more comprehensive perspective and ultimately attain a more powerful way of being. And so, it is in the spirit of harmony and balance that we turn our attention to a world largely suffering from an absence of such holistic virtues. Part 2. Holistic Assessment of Society. Human beings are not ignorant or unremarkable by nature. Our current state of profound unconsciousness is the result of intrusive conditioning steadily waged against us over many successive generations. A predatory ruling class have largely been successful in disempowering humanity by tactfully assaulting the interdependent faculties of man's awareness, causing intellectual and emotional disharmony and undermining willpower in order to more easily manipulate humanity's collective behavior. By leveraging occulted knowledge regarding the workings of human consciousness, these predators have skillfully debased the collective vibratory frequency of man's consciousness, decreasing such consciousness to a level that likely represents an all-time low. Previously in tune with higher aspects of subtle awareness, modern man now resides almost exclusively in the base awareness of five-sense reality, a reality disconnected from the higher knowings and inner passions of consciousness in its naturally evolving state. Before we can further assess the mechanisms of control responsible for the current unconscious state of humanity and the diseased predatory psyches behind its implementation, we must break any remaining conditioning within ourselves and raise our consciousness to a heightened state of awareness, an awareness capable of perceiving beyond the limited scope of consensus entrancement with a sober, penetrating discernment. The assorted faculties of one's conscious awareness must be identified and harmoniously exercised in an optimum working order. Such faculties are thought, emotion, and willpower, three primal aspects of being that comprise the principal pillars of consciousness. As a person's thoughts and emotions are brought into a state of accord, and not into the states of conflict or detachment that have sadly came to embody the human norm, it is through the harmonious unity of such thinking and feeling that one can then truly exercise their individual will. In this way, and only in this way, can meaningful action take place and real healing change be effected in this world. This threefold equation of thinking, feeling, and willfully acting forms a trivium that, when genuinely applied to the art of being, transforms the mere concept of such into a valuable gnosis. For gnosis is a living knowledge that presents itself through direct, participatory contact. Indeed, the active use of such experiential wisdom helps activate higher forms of individual conscious awareness and builds a holistic intelligence that aligns personal perception with authentic reality, burning away the fog of the chaotic modern world and allowing truth to be readily ascertained and integrated into an evolving philosophy of being. Holistic intelligence grants a razor-sharp acuity with which to see the world that casts aside the veil of consensus misperception, allowing the light of true awakening to enter one's life, a light that casts few shadows, for it allows the individual to perceive from a balanced array of the most authentic vantage points. In turning our holistic vision to modern society, it becomes quite absurdly obvious that corruptions of consciousness are epidemic in a climate of social predation. Sadly, such corruption exists within the vast majority of individual psyches, allowing this predation to more easily occur and gain momentum through time. The dysfunction seen in human consciousness takes many forms, manifesting in a variety of ways. Yet at root, such dysfunction can most always be linked to disharmony between thoughts, emotions, and willpower. The crucial interplay between these facets of being affects the quality of social conduct among individuals, which in turn translates into the greater societal narrative. An honest evaluation of today's collective narrative reveals the presence of a predatory ruling class that works to dominate and exploit the remainder of mass humanity. This predatory class exists high atop a pyramidal control system that can be described as a hierarchy of 7 distinct levels. At the bottom, base level of the pyramid are the Abulic masses, representing the overwhelming majority of society, generating both physical and non-physical resources for the uppermost levels of the pyramid. At level 2 are the enforcers, the rank-and-file members of the police, military, and private security organizations. They unquestioningly enforce the laws, policies, and procedures of the system through weapon-backed acts of violence and duress waged upon the public at large. Level 3 is the political level. This level serves as an artificial facade of predominantly communist and capitalist governmental regimes, obscuring the actual maneuverings and real policies made behind the scenes. The political level is the theater of government. Moving upward to level 4, we reach the level of Realpolitik, from the German Real, meaning realistic, practical, or actual, and Politik, or politics. Realpolitik is political action based in power, resource, and practicality, rather than ethics or morality. Above Realpolitik resides level 5, the level of Parapolitics. Power politics carried out exclusively in a covertly unaccountable manner, with an emphasis on force, collusion, and deception. Included here are the upper echelons of the elite political, economic, and intelligence organizations, the global think tanks, and the highest elements of the black technocracy. Although light years removed from the 5-sense conception of modern man, at level 6 resides an ancient and unbroken genetic lineage of practicing dark occultists, who work to subvert the natural evolution of man's consciousness by way of the acute stratification of knowledge and technology throughout all lower levels of the pyramid, doing so ultimately to harvest low vibrational human consciousness for the purposes of Illuminism, a spirituality characterized by a synthesis of ancient mystery, tradition, and ritual, numerology, lunar, solar, and Saturnian symbolism, and communion with negative ultra-terrestrial consciousness. Through meticulous interbreeding, the Illuminists of level 6 have encouraged specific DNA characteristics to arise within members of the rulership, including the predatory consciousness that informs the dominant subject matter of this presentation. Such an initially bizarre-seeming reality further reaffirms the importance of utilizing all faculties of conscious awareness at our disposal, for such information radically challenges what use of solely the intellect would permit, instead requiring a firmly established uplink to the intuitive realm and a strong rooting in the will to proceed without loss of bearing. It is in the tenor of such awareness that we proceed with care and vigilance to the pyramid's apex. Astonishingly, level 7 is represented by malevolent ultra-terrestrial consciousness, a dark, preternatural intelligence involving prehistoric, galactic, and extra-dimensional elements, non-human predators that have long communed with the Illuminist sorcerers of the ruling class in the ongoing subjugation of humanity. There is much more to explore here within the extraordinary dynamics of this ultra-terrestrial presence, particularly in its ancient and ongoing communion with the occult rulership. But for the moment, let us set aside any non-human elements in our further examination of the predation inherent to modern society. Part 3. Ruling class predation versus natural predation. In order to fully understand the predatory dynamics of modern society, it is useful to begin by comparing such social dynamics to predation as it commonly occurs in nature, identifying key similarities and differences in the formulation of a working diagnosis. Although some mystical philosophies allude to the intriguing notion that all predation is unnatural, even that which occurs in the so-called natural world, let us suspend such deeper concepts in our initial analysis of the subject. For the moment, we shall deem the predatory dynamics seen in nature as natural predation, and those dynamics seen between the rulership and the remainder of collective society as ruling class predation. It is additionally important not to confuse our allusions to nature with any Darwinian notions of competition-based evolution, for the Darwinian evolutionary model was in fact promoted and upheld by the predatory class themselves to reinforce the caste system of hereditary-based control, the very system that continues to quietly operate to this day. We instead refer to nature with an understanding that Earth-based biological interactions are simply physical representations of the deeper energetic dynamics that permeate organic life and set it into motion. Within the ecology of the natural world, predation is a biological interaction that occurs when a predator, or a particular organism that is hunting, feeds upon its prey, or the organism that is being hunted. Natural predation most commonly results in the death of prey and the eventual absorption of the prey's tissue through the act of consumption. The phenomenon of ruling class predation involves quite different dynamics, however. Although the various tactics employed by the ruling class can be equated to a form of hunting, the predator-to-prey interaction does not result in death for bodily consumption. Though death by way of occult ritual, particularly through the highly ritualized human sacrifice seen in war and the instrument of statecraft known as terrorism, as well as death through other acts of democide, including mass depopulation and the genocidal annihilation of targeted ethnicities and cultural modes of being, all certainly have been and still remain aspects of the ruling class's long-term agenda. The immediate, sustained dynamics of ruling class predation involve a type of consumption or harvesting of both vast material resources and the lower vibrational energy of debased human consciousness. We must further refine our working diagnosis, then, by once again turning to nature and finding a more accurate precedent. Parasitism is a specific form of predation characterized by a non-mutual symbiotic relationship between species, where one species, the parasite, benefits at the expense of the other, the host. It is in parasitism that we find a much closer description of the predator-to-prey relationship seen in collective society. Similarity can be seen with the fact that the ruling class performs parasitism for a benefit gained at the expense of the host or mass humanity. A key similarity to also acknowledge is the symbiotic nature of the parasitic relationship, as symbiosis simply means that the relationship occurs perpetually through time, a trademark feature of the inhumanly patient ruling class's multi-generational agenda. However, not all criteria are fulfilled by this definition. For recall that natural parasitism is characterized by a non-mutual relationship. The brilliance of the control system involves the fact that its tyranny does not compromise the law of free will. Although this initially may seem perplexing, a holistic analysis of the dynamics of will and societal behavior reveals that the control system is indeed cleverly organized to manufacture the people's implicit consent. Through cunning techniques of social engineering, predictive programming, and occult methodology, the masses are alerted to the control system's actions, and through non-objection and resistance-free participation within the system itself, the people grant their implicit consent. Such inaction in the face of tyranny may be a silent consent, but such is still a willful consent nonetheless. Any real violations of will that supplement the system are performed by individuals within it who are willing to obey a chain of authority amongst a hierarchy of compartmentalized knowledge. The Illuminists atop the power pyramid are indeed aware of natural law, namely the universal consequences incurred from directly infringing upon the free will of others. Thus the ruling class strategically gains the implicit consent of the people to insulate themselves from any universal retribution that would otherwise result from their operations in the world. Willpower thus reveals itself as the most crucial element in the social predatory equation. For although all modes of low-fidelity consciousness are indeed harvested, free will is the foremost important energetic dynamic addressed by the ruling class in the ongoing subjugation of the masses, for indeed willpower plays the supreme role in determining the collective behavior of humanity. To maintain the perpetual cultivation of low vibrational consciousness, the people's will must always be undermined. In order to fully complete our diagnosis, one additional aspect of ruling class predation is worth elucidating. This is the noteworthy fact that the ruling class prey upon members of their own species. In the ecology of nature, predation that occurs in this way between members of the same species is called intraspecific predation. And so, in consolidating all aspects of our working diagnosis, we formulate a compound term that can, at least scientifically, describe the dynamics of ruling class predation in our world. Such can be labeled as mutual intraspecific parasitism, which admittedly suffers from the limiting nature of language itself, yet is nonetheless illustrative of the complex corruption inherent to human society. The mere apprehension of such a scientific diagnosis only partially enlightens our perspective, however. In order to more fully perceive these parasitic predators for what they genuinely are, we must come to know their psyche. Part 4. Psyche of Disharmony. Comparing the trivium of holistic intelligence to the corrupt consciousness of the ruling class can additionally provide us with valuable insight. The wisdom imparted by this holistic method of discernment tells us that such an unnatural state of being as that exhibited by elitist parasitic predation is likely indicative of specific states of conflict or detachment within the ruling class's thoughts, emotions, and/or willpower. The intricate framework of society and the cleverly devised tactics of the ruling class in the ongoing manipulation and exploitation of humanity demonstrates that these predators are certainly not lacking in intellect, and in fact exhibit a ready abundance of such. Therefore, among the three main facets of their consciousness, the ruling class's capacity for analytical thinking must solidly be present. Moreover, the intense yet patient drive exhibited by the rulership in the near ubiquitous domination of the physical realm demonstrates a coherent grasp of asserting strong intention when taking action, as the ruling class obviously possess a deep understanding of the role that willpower plays in the efficacy of behavior, as well as the will's customary function in manifesting reality. Thus we can conclude that the will of the ruling class must also be firmly intact. But in consideration of the ruthless manner in which the parasitic class continue to relentlessly exploit an Abulic humanity with no seeming conscience or compassion for their actions, it is in the emotional facet of the predator's consciousness that we finally perceive a flaw. Carried out with cold and calculated maneuverability, the global governance agenda continues, exhibiting nary a shred of honesty or empathy for those in its path. As the ruling class's self-proclaimed great work trudges onward, crushing a suffering humanity beneath its massive weight, any quintessentially human feelings of care or compassion for mass humanity are quite obviously in short supply. Indeed, such higher capacity for genuine concern regarding the plight of others is absent in the ruling class's ongoing subjugation of mankind. Recall that the harmonization of all basic faculties of conscious awareness serves to heighten the vibratory frequency of human consciousness. The fact that the ruling class are disharmoniously operating with one aspect of their consciousness severely compromised can in part account for the lowly and unnatural quality of their behavior. Such poor conduct is exhibited both individually and collectively among the rulership, as personal and group behavior are inextricably related social dynamics. Such a determined willpower and high capacity for cognitive intellect, paired with little to no capacity for true empathy in the skillful manipulation of others, forms the near exact modus operandi for a quite infamous and often misunderstood form of dysfunctional consciousness known as psychopathy. Psychopathy is a heterogeneous disorder, meaning it occurs in varying degrees of severity and exists in more than one variety. Psychopathy itself occurs in primary and secondary forms. Let's explore this curious condition that plays such a crucially relevant role in the past, present, and future of the human species. Part 5. Primary Psychopathy. Primary psychopathy is a genetic disorder of the human psyche, characterized by a deficiency in emotional acuity, and in particular, by a severely diminished capacity for empathy or remorse in one's actions. Only a very small portion of humanity are born genuine psychopaths, officially comprising a mere 1 to 4% of the overall human population, with the actual number likely closer to only a fraction of 1%. Yet despite seemingly small numbers, the role psychopaths have played in historic and modern civilization has been of enormous influence. Although psychopathy is not limited to members of the ruling class, appearing instead within all strata of society, psychopathy undoubtedly is much more prevalent in the uppermost echelons of the pyramidal power structure than its apparent scarcity would otherwise suggest. This fact can both be reasoned and felt as an authentic statement, simply by perceptively identifying the psychopathic tendencies inherent to society's framework, and realizing through direct experiential contact with the system that suppression of higher human emotion seems especially necessary for adequately achieving consensus goals and successfully climbing the power hierarchy of the system itself. Such a framework, then, was no doubt initially structured and subsequently expanded upon by the psychopathic ruling class themselves. The primary psychopath exhibits a biological predisposition for dysfunction within the emotional facet of their perceptive awareness, thus exhibiting a fundamental limitation in their capacity for holistic intelligence. It is important here to distinguish between intelligence and intellect, as psychopathic individuals often display a cunning intellect with a high capacity for analytical thinking, but are severely limited in the aforementioned intelligent harmony of thinking supplemented by feeling. Such dysfunction of holistic intelligence is exhibited from birth onward, resulting from a hereditary defect in the primary psychopath's genetic makeup that directly affects the physiology of their brain. As we explore the genetic deficiencies of the psychopathic brain, it is extremely important to keep in mind that consciousness itself does not arise from within the brain. Rather, consciousness emanates from a non-material source, moving through the circuitry of the brain to produce the experience of brain-based human awareness. With any holistic analysis, though, we must cover all angles, indeed of those both physical and metaphysical. Thus, the biological abnormalities seen in true genetic psychopathy are essential aspects of this condition to elucidate. The brain of the primary psychopath exhibits defective and imbalanced functionality in the neo-mammalian or new mammalian brain's neocortex and prefrontal cortex, the paleo-mammalian or old mammalian brain's amygdala and other aspects of the limbic system, and hyperactive functionality in the brain's reptilian complex. In normal brain physiology, the prefrontal cortex, or front outer portion of the new mammalian brain, orchestrates intellectual and emotional facets of awareness in order for an individual to take action in accordance with internal goals. Psychopaths exhibit a perceptive disconnect in the prefrontal cortex, affecting communication between internal goals and emotions, causing the psychopath's thoughts and actions to be largely disconnected from emotional perception. In the old mammalian brain, within normal neurobiology, the amygdala and other areas of the limbic system play fundamental roles in the processing of decision-making and reacting to emotions. In psychopaths, areas of the limbic brain are suppressed or altogether inactive, while the amygdala is often overstimulated by constant signaling from the psychopath's hyperactive reptilian complex. The reptilian complex, or R complex, was the earliest portion of the evolutionary human brain to develop. The R complex controls motor function, respiration, survival mechanisms, and instinctual responses to potential danger, genetic survival, and in particular, the so-called kill or be killed instinct. When a normal brain becomes aware of external threat or sexual opportunity, the amygdala and limbic system transmit specific signals to the R complex, releasing the stress hormone norepinephrine, creating a heightened state of vigilant awareness. In the hyperactive R complex of the psychopath, the brain becomes flooded with norepinephrine, causing the psychopath to experience an intense rush or extreme sense of excitement, particularly when they are operating in full predator mode, acting like a powerful norepinephrine injection engine that constantly works to perpetually incentivize such aggressive behavior. On an electrochemical level, the psychopath is addicted to the carnal desires of base consciousness, as such low vibrational energy is incessantly cycled through the lower circuitry of their reptilian complex. Not only, then, is the psychopathic brain unable to readily process human emotion, but it is physiologically hardwired to reinforce aggressive, predatory behavior. The result is nothing less than an inhuman monster, a heartless imposter masquerading as a compassionate human being, feeling nothing save for a chemical joy gleaned from the suffering inflicted upon others. The psychopathic brain truly represents a perfect storm of defective conditional factors, facilitating a personality optimally tailored for skillful social predation. For if both lack of empathy and strong electrochemical incentive were not enough, the R-complex itself readily interfaces with the highly analytical cognition of the left hemisphere of the neocortex. When the left brain is acutely dominant, the R-complex then fully assumes all executive functioning of the brain, completely overriding the limbic system and altogether suppressing its interface with the intuition and compassion-based thinking exhibited in the neocortex's right hemisphere. This confluence of neurological factors leaves the psychopath totally immersed in a left brain modality of thinking, one highly prone to developing an authoritarian mentality of control. This left hemisphere of the new mammalian brain largely facilitates scientific, logistic, and mathematical-based cognition. Thus, the psychopath's heavily imbalanced overusage of this hemisphere tends to build a high aptitude in such disciplines of thinking. The often clever intellect and supreme logic of the psychopath further allows for predatory success, as psychopathic individuals are often tactfully cunning in the manipulation of others, including a highly skilled ability to mimic the entire range of normal human emotions in order to appear outwardly benevolent. It is not difficult to perceive, therefore, the reasoning inherent to the aforementioned strategic interbreeding among the uppermost echelons of the ruling class, as hereditarily encouraging psychopathic personalities is indeed beneficial to the parasitic predatory class in the ongoing subjugation and exploitation of mass humanity, as the psychopath indeed takes full advantage of an outer shell of apparent normalcy to conceal a dark, internal landscape completely void of morality. How interesting it is, when relating such a psychopathic capacity for charming insincerity to our pyramidal model of the control system, that we see this identical setup of an artificial shell, or in this case, the level 3 facade of government, that serves only to conceal the dark immorality exhibited within the uppermost levels of the pyramid. It is this supremely deceptive and covert nature of the modern control system that facilitates a true golden age of psychopathy. For although past imperial cultures exhibited prolific psychopathic tendencies, for instance in the extreme violence and debauchery performed by the latter two-thirds of the Roman Empire, it is with today's grossly inflated population of near ubiquitous ignorance and naivety to tyranny that allows for a modern psychopathic rulership to optimally fulfill diseased predatory urges in a manner most closely aligned to the chameleon-like modus operandi exhibited in psychopathic social predation. Today's psychopathic elite operate in almost absolute secrecy and skillfully manipulate, relentlessly exploit, and even egotistically mock what has essentially become a near fully globalized and dim-witted population, the overwhelming majority of whom are completely oblivious to the elite social predators that seek to completely destroy all remaining divinity within humanity, as human beings have been so debased in consciousness that they will willingly beg for their own enslavement and unquestioningly assume their individual positions within the pyramidal hierarchy of authoritarian control. For such a system requires large numbers of right-brain slave mentalities and left-brain master mentalities, both of which are neatly framed in an overarching and singular hive mentality of congruent consensus perception. Modern civilization thus reveals itself to be a psychopathic system made by psychopaths for psychopaths, as such is no doubt characteristically mirrored in the microcosmic individual and macrocosm of collective society itself. The system has been meticulously constructed to breed psychopathy in all levels of the pyramidal hierarchy, causing psychopathic tendencies to arise in individuals who would otherwise possess no genetic predisposition for the disorder. Non-genetic psychopathy that occurs in this way, due to experiential contact and/or trauma within the contrived environmental factors of society, embodies the condition in its secondarily psychopathic form. Part 6. Secondary Psychopathy. It could be quite persuasively argued that psychopathy, in this non-genetic, secondary form, poses an even greater threat to humanity than those grave dangers posed by that of primary psychopathy. This is due to the comparatively high prevalence of secondary psychopaths, as modern society has been extremely successful in encouraging psychopathic personalities, with some estimates suggesting that as high as 1 in 3 people exhibit at least moderate forms of secondarily psychopathic tendencies. This congruence of social behavior would not be possible were it not for the control system's uncanny ability to encourage groupthink, a system of thought whereby members of the group reach consensus conclusions without critically analyzing specific ideas and concepts. As such, an efficient social structuring requires the edifice of a mainstream worldview, one that ultimately steers individuals into the polarized, socially engineered roles of both master and slave, while discouraging the uniquely independent mentality naturally inherent to every individual, as in reality, a human being's birthright is upheld by the inviolable laws of nature, granting authority over no other human being save for the free will possessed by one's individuated self. The perverse construct of consensus reality is indeed responsible for encouraging the high prevalence of secondary psychopaths, as such a construct represents a psychopathic mental model of the world and not the true world in itself, for it is at once a description, a simulation, and a set of unnatural man-made laws that form a representational idea of the world, one specifically designed to displace genuine reality with a supremely articulated yet wholly unnatural alternative to the multi-dimensional splendor exhibited by authentic reality. Modern man has been steadily conditioned to inhabit a false idea of the world and not the world in itself. For the sake of further elucidating this notion, let us metaphorically compare man's mental habitation of an idea to his physical habitation of a literal stone pyramid. Indeed, the potential habitations of both an immaterial idea and the inner chambers of a material stone pyramid, although seemingly different concepts, are at root essentially the same. For with both the stone pyramid and the idea, it is only the form of each that is fundamentally different. The pyramid is itself represented by energy condensed into the form of stone blocks that structurally comprise the pyramid, whereas an idea is represented by energy condensed into the form of interdependent thoughts that structurally comprise the totality of the idea. The subtle distinction between the two structures is simply a matter of density and oscillation, as all forms in existence, indeed of both physical and mental varieties, are derived from the very same energetic building blocks that envelop and permeate the whole of existence itself. The fundamentally energetic construct of consensus reality represents a sanitized, imbalanced, and extremely limited version of reality, fabricated by the architects of civilization and energetically broadcast as a stand-in imitation of the real thing. In order for this distorted version of reality to function in a manner that most adequately supplements the system, the people's consent is fundamentally forever required. Consent itself is granted by willfully feeding one's consciousness into the energetic construct that comprises the system. The more consciousness the system amasses in this way, the more authentic and permanent its constructed reality appears to be. It is the energetic nature of the mainstream edifice, as well as the people's consensual operation within it, that are both primary causes for why such a system ultimately encourages secondarily psychopathic personalities to arise. Since such a fabricated reality was in fact initially built by a psychopathic rulership, it is in the willful adherence to this artificial reality's rules and regulations for successful operation within the system itself that requires a state of consciousness more closely aligned with psychopathic tendencies. To engage with the system by assuming a master's role, no matter the level of the hierarchy, in order to reap the system's built-in social and material rewards, requires the adoption of a left-brain, authoritarian mindset and a willful suppression of the compassionate and empathetic emotions of the heart. The long-term assumption of such a self-altered philosophy of being rewires the individual for secondarily psychopathic tendencies. And in order to further self-rationalize such cold-hearted behavior, the system quite readily provides a modern dogma of scientific materialism, a Darwinian survivalist worldview that allows budding psychopaths to override any existing personal remorse by rationalizing their lowly behavior with comforting thoughts of self-superiority, all the while operating in a spiritually dead, randomly mechanized, dog-eat-dog universal construct. This exclusively mind-based worldview of scientific materialism, when translated to its extreme, has manifested within the upper levels of the pyramidal model, particularly in the parapolitics of level 5, as the psychopathic mindset collectively responsible for the horrors of the black technocracy. For vast material resources have been devoted to this extremely unbalanced, spiritually depraved, and poisonous worldview that has given birth to such atrocities as the military-industrial complex, misguided utopian visions, inhuman experimentations of a burgeoning scientific dictatorship, and in particular as the nightmare of transhumanism. The idea that a singularity of artificial intelligence could surpass the sentient, holistic intelligence of a human being is itself patently ridiculous and is indicative of a fundamental misapprehension of the nature and source of consciousness itself, as consciousness does not, cannot, and will not arise from within the physiological circuitry of the brain. Nevertheless, primarily and secondarily psychopathic individuals have in droves converged to this penultimate height of the human control hierarchy and continue to further the outrageously unenlightened development of black-budget physical technologies to further the power gap between the predatory class and mass humanity. Prolonged secrecy in the long-term parasitic accrual of vast material resources has caused the technological divide to become so fully widened that some researchers suggest the reality of a breakaway civilization, that is, from the order of the highest elements of the parapolitical level upward, the ruling elites now possess such highly advanced technological capabilities that they are able to travel and potentially populate the depths of the solar system, perhaps even engaging in travel of an interstellar nature. It is contact with transdimensional reality and the accompanied intelligence that dwells therein that has long motivated the Illuminists at level 6 of the power pyramid, but such has little to do with technologies of a physical kind, only insofar as the human body technologically represents a physical genetic vessel for communion with ultra-terrestrial spiritual energies. These Illuminist sorcerers are, in fact, dark masters of energetic persuasion. Thus, the energetic construct of mainstream reality is continuously fine-tuned and bolstered through various occult acts of sorcery waged against the collective consciousness of man. Illuminists specialize in orchestrating small-scale events of organized chaos that send macro ripples of fear and hatred throughout the holographic fabric of the fourth density. The constant ritualized reinforcement of male-dominant energies and the blasphemous undermining of the sacred feminine and virgin goddess principles are the trademark signatures exhibited by many of the Illuminists' modern mega rituals. From the assault of the virgin goddess, for instance, seen in the orchestrated massacre at Virginia Tech, to the subversions of the goddess Columbia in the sacrificial slaughter at Columbine and the ritual incineration of the Columbia Space Shuttle, or in particular, by the ultimate attack of the sacred union of the divine masculine and feminine energies seen in the sorcerous masterwork of our current psychopathic golden age, the events of September 11th, 2001, the intent is the same: to create, through numerological and symbolic significance, an energetic resonance pattern characterized by an overtly male, unbalanced spiritual archetype of trauma and fear-based energy that, when witnessed and vicariously experienced on a massive scale, will widely resonate on a macro level throughout the whole of society to reinforce the matrix of a psychopathic mainstream paradigm, discouraging quintessentially human emotions of care, compassion, and loving truth within the collective consciousness of humanity. 9/11 itself truly represented the premier ritual event of a contemporary golden age of psychopathy, as it combined the latest gadgets of the technotronic era with the darkest sorceries of high chaos magic for a spectacular mega ritual witnessed on a truly global scale, covering all bases of the latest physical and darkest metaphysical technologies. The events of that day embodied elitist psychopathy in its purest form, for it addressed both dimensional facets of the elitist paradigm, from the third density reality of scientific materialism to the fourth density reality of dark spiritualism. 9/11 was the collective epitome of psychopathic proliferation and the symbolic marker of an age, for it combined the highest sequestered technologies of the black technocracy, such as the weaponization of free energy technology and a blue beam-like holography, with the highest elements of ritual Illuminism seen in dark Freemasonry, Tarot, and Kabbalah, ensuring that none of the events witnessed and experienced on that day even remotely resembled what they seemed to be, creating an interdimensionally penetrating resonance of deception and trauma that on a subconscious level served to triumphantly hail the dark reality of a psychopathic golden age. Indeed, the ultimate purpose of 9/11 was not political or economic, but sorcerous, for attaining control over the dreaming mind of man, and the harnessing and marshalling of its forces was the omnipotent driving force of such a psychopathic scenario of malice and degradation. The transformation of humanity was the authentic motive for 9/11 and the ultimate goal of the parasitic predatory class. In consideration of the constant retuning and reinforcing of the consensus energetic construct, it is no wonder that secondary psychopathy continues to proliferate, as environmental factors, particularly of an energetic variety, are in part epigenetically responsible for physical changes within individual biology. In epigenetics, certain base pairings of genetic expressions in DNA and RNA are either activated or made dormant due to emotive vibratory energies of consciousness. This in fact means that an individual's neurophysiology can, over time, begin to transform itself into the specific physiology seen in true genetic psychopathy, due to the body's constant contact with society's manufactured psychopathic energies. The perpetual violence and cruelty seen in our modern world, then, now makes more sense, as we have now quite thoroughly elucidated this genetic and indeed energetically contagious disease of psychopathy. We have explored the human physiology's genetic and epigenetic interface with the condition, and have evaluated the psychopathic nature of our contemporary society, assessing the psychopathic rulership atop society's power hierarchy. But to fully complete our holistic analysis of the disorder, we must consider psychopathy from a more metaphysically spiritual perspective. Part 7. Metaphysical Psychopathy. It is only after a thorough, and shall we say more terrestrial exploration of psychopathy that we now venture into the more challenging aspects of the condition. To hastily and eccentrically proclaim that all psychopaths are reptilian shapeshifters without any prior critical analysis of the disorder serves only to undermine psychopathy's true nature and distracts from credible, biologically oriented research on the subject. At the same time, only addressing psychopathy from a strictly scientific angle serves to equally distort psychopathy's reality. It is important to realize that any information in of itself is neutral in value. Information viewed through the lenses of critical and intuitive awareness becomes knowledge. Knowledge, with deep absorption and spiritual insight, becomes wisdom. And the application of this wisdom through direct experience becomes gnosis. It is with a clear consciousness that we can approach metaphysical reality in a self-empowering way. In addressing psychopathy with such clear awareness, we come to realize that the condition indeed manifests as a debased or altogether absent capacity for higher emotional awareness, due predominantly to a lack of the sacred feminine spiritual essence. As previously stated, the intellect of the mind, the intuition of the heart, and the active volition of the will form the trivium of holistic human consciousness. These energetic aspects of awareness are not separate, rather they are interdependent, and thus are either in harmonious or disharmonious communication with one another. In this model, the psychopath's absence or otherwise low vibrational quality of heart-based emotional energy poorly engages or altogether fails to engage the right hemisphere of the neocortex and the old mammalian physiology of the limbic brain. That is, it is not exclusively the psychopathic brain in itself that is defective. Rather, the psychopath lacks the spiritual resonance necessary to activate aspects of their genetic coding responsible for proper neurophysiological development. Masculine spiritual energy is channeled as the intellectual consciousness of the mind and is translated by the left hemisphere of the neocortex. Feminine spiritual energy is channeled as the intuitive and emotional consciousness of the heart, which is then further translated by the right hemisphere of the neocortex. Psychopathy is a spiritual deficiency, one that is overly masculine and left-brained, lacking the spiritual harmony of the divine feminine essence and this energy's accompanied interface with the brain's right hemisphere. The union of sacred male and female energy gives birth to divine free will, as the threefold harmonization of thoughts, emotions, and willful action embodies holistic intelligence, the true divine potential of higher human consciousness. The overly male, predatory behavior of the psychopath is far from divine and represents an imbalanced, lower vibrational consciousness. It is this particular psychopathic resonance that tends to facilitate a parasitic spiritual relationship with an energetically compatible type of fourth density consciousness, a non-human intelligence that is also manifested without the harmonic balance of male and female unity. Existing in the spiritual realm are certain ultra-terrestrial intelligences, beings that have not yet risen beyond the polarization of positive and negative forces, and are in themselves far from the divine. Such dark spiritual beings remain distorted by inversions of self-conceit and destruction, as these entities are still very much compelled by attraction and repulsion in the good versus evil dynamics of extreme polarity. Contained in a realm that is still subject to entropy, these entities require a source of power, just as human beings need food to be physically sustained. Lower density human consciousness is a prime target for this fourth density sustenance, so long as it is of the same resonance, albeit an octave lower, as the consciousness it is channeled into. The self-conceiting and destructive nature of psychopathic consciousness, with its male imbalance and lower vibratory density, thus readily entices this malevolent ultra-terrestrial intelligence. On a metaphysical level, the disease of psychopathy can be considered as a type of low spiritual immunity that attracts these non-human, ultra-dimensional parasites. Such inorganic beings identify certain energy oscillations, such as consciousness of a psychopathic variety, using its perpetual emanation of low vibrational consciousness as energetic nourishment to stave off the entropy they remain subject to in the fourth density realm. It is not exclusively psychopathic consciousness that is fed upon by these spiritual predators, however, for low human consciousness in general can serve as an energetic source of sustenance. But it is the constant state of low-density consciousness emanated by the psychopath that is fine-tuned for the male-dominant energy of these predators, supremely allowing for an established symbiotic relationship between the spiritual parasite and psychopathic host. Predominantly, this spiritual parasitic infection would not be consciously known to the psychopathic individual. Rather, the psychopath would perceive their cruel and unnatural urges as exclusively their own, remaining for the most part unaware of the dark spiritual persuasion that may be partially responsible for influencing their destructive behavior. The spiritual parasite channels or interfaces their essence with the psychopath's consciousness. Thus this, for lack of a less loaded term, spiritual possession, is more than likely a type of unconscious collaborative relationship from the perspective of the human host. But particularly with the Illuminists of the ruling class, a scenario emerges in which practicing psychopathic occultists may indeed be aware of, and in actuality commune with, these non-human spiritual personalities. Perhaps even intentionally channeling or merging with certain dark entities in the further fulfillment of their own twisted spiritual and predatory desires. Let us consult the wisdom of our ancestors for more insight into these dark, ultra-terrestrial entities. Many spiritual traditions, in fact, speak of these malevolent, supernatural beings. It is modern man's grossly material and nearsighted scientific worldview that rejects such an astonishing reality. Traditionally, these spiritual entities have been quite colorfully described, for instance with their more commonly known labeling seen in several examples including the Archons, the Jinn, the Orions, the Devils, and the Demons. They have been known as the Black Wings, the Holes, the Flyers, and yes, even as the infamous so-called shape-shifting reptilians. The cartoonishly vivid and eccentric baggage that often accompanies such descriptions should not detract from the quite serious and very real nature of these predators, however. When the human mind comes into contact with fourth-density reality, it often interprets such energetic information using whatever references it is familiar with in an attempt to make sense of the encounter. Thus the vivid and at times bizarre descriptions that accompany such contact with ultra-terrestrial entities is not as odd as it initially may seem to be. The congruent seen in such imaginative constructs can perhaps be explained by the collective mythos inherent to a specific class of individuals, as well as the particular geographic region where such encounters take place. As such, a direct spiritual contact with fourth-density reality becomes a permanent artifact in this energetic field, an artifact that may further the energetic permanence of a certain narrative as it is experientially reinforced by many different individuals over time. To further explore such supernatural adversaries, let us turn our attention to the mystical philosophy of pre-Christian Gnosticism and the text of the Nag Hammadi library. From the opening paragraph of the tractate The Hypostasis of the Archons, the Apostle Paul is stated as saying humanity's, quote, contest is not against flesh and blood, rather the authorities of the universe and the spirits of wickedness, unquote. The word authorities here is the widely understood terminology for the archons, spiritual ruling entities that represent the malevolent, ultra-terrestrial consciousness comprising level 7 of our pyramidal model. Such dark, inorganic beings are indeed deeply involved in the affairs of this world, perhaps even playing a role in the creation of the physical world itself. Roger Bullard's introduction to the Hypostasis of the Archons expounds upon this opening text by stating, quote, the reality of the archontic rulers. Far from being merely fictitious, imaginary powers, the archons are all too real. These rulers indeed exist. This is a grim reality for the Christian Gnostics, who define their own spiritual nature in opposition to that of the ruling and enslaving authorities, unquote. One of many possible narratives emerges here, whereby in some darkening age of our ancient past, a specific genetic lineage of individuals with an already compromised consciousness who would one day come to rule humanity may have been engaged by this non-human spiritual consciousness. and due perhaps to impressive non-temporal illusions and seemingly powerful displays of godlike fourth density magic, as well as clever appeals to vulnerable human egos. This dark spiritual intelligence may have won favor, worship, and even willful allegiance, perhaps even deeming this specific group of individuals as being such an impostor gods, so-called chosen people. In exchange for worldly power and potential dominion over the physical realm, this naive class may have been made privy to specific high knowledge and granted certain conscious abilities in exchange for the willing degradation of their spiritual integrity. The intense pride and egotistical madness that accompanied being such a false god's so-called chosen people may have compelled this class to begin the ages-old process of meticulous interbreeding with one another. Such forced unions of planned sexual copulation were not carried out in the name of love, as is the natural way of procreation, but instead were performed in the name of dark, egotistical intentions of selfishness and an unnatural self-conceit. This dark procreation may have perpetually degraded this future ruling class's spiritual essence, eventually leading to a completely separate and essentially inhuman race of individuals, deeply immersed in a psychopathic and overtly male modality of being. This psychopathic race of people, again for lack of less loaded terminology, may have willingly sold their soul at some point in time in the ancient world, in exchange for the pleasures and powers that accompany dominating the whole of material reality, in essence being cleverly persuaded and bargained by this malevolent spiritual consciousness to darkly collaborate in the transformation of a formerly free earth into what has essentially become a soul farm for the harvesting of low-fidelity human consciousness in order for such spiritual parasites to sustain themselves in fourth-density reality. This predatory consciousness would undoubtedly require a constant appeasement of energetic sustenance, thus the constant blood-sacrificing, cyclical mass mega-rituals, and constant reinforcement of a psychopathic social construct forever is upheld, lest the ruling class suffer extreme consequence, in all probability existing under the constant threat of losing their current domineering status, as well as whatever additional benefits they have gained from such a relationship. Such a scenario represents just one possibility of the so-called fall of man scenario, and we shall momentarily explore other hypotheses. But one thing is certain. The similarity seen between the predatory techniques of the ruling class and the predatory techniques of this inhuman spiritual consciousness is a congruence that cannot be ignored. We learn yet more regarding these spiritual predators and the parasitic techniques they employ from the Nag Hammadi Library's authoritative teaching. It reads, quote, "For man-eaters will seize us and swallow us, rejoicing like a fisherman casting a hook into the water. For he casts many kinds of food into the water, because each one of the fish has his own food. He smells it and pursues its odor, but when he eats it, the hook hidden within the food seizes him and brings him up by force out of the deep waters. No man is able then to catch that fish down in the deep waters, except for the trap that the fisherman sets. By the ruse of food he brought the fish up on the hook. In this very way we exist in this world like fish. The adversary spies on us, lying in wait for us like fishermen, wishing to seize us, rejoicing that he might swallow us. For he places many foods before our eyes, things which belong to this world. He wishes to make us desire one of them and to taste only a little, so that he may seize us with his hidden poison, and bring us out of freedom and take us into slavery. For whenever he catches us with a single food, it is indeed necessary for us to desire the rest. Finally then, such things become the food of death." Unquote. The congruence here between the tactics used by such spiritual predators of the fourth density and the tactics used by the human predators of the ruling class is a quite remarkable connection. Whether such occurred via the aforementioned narrative of a dark spiritual communion or by way of other means, such similarity reveals a deeply ironic scenario. For just as the ruling class deceptively exploits the materialistic and egotistical weaknesses of humanity to parasitically prey upon man, So too does this malevolent spiritual consciousness utilize the very same techniques in the exploitation of the ruling class. It is either that the ruling class began as natural spiritual human beings and due to a dark spiritual bargaining subsequently degraded over time into the inhuman psychopaths they have come to embody, or they were initially conceived altogether differently and have always exhibited such predatory tendencies, for they were created in error by not the utmost God of creation, but by a lower demigod lacking balance and purity of intention. For insight into this latter possibility, we turn to the Nag Hammadi Library's tripartite tractate, which explains how all human beings are not in fact equal creations. Rather, it explains, there are in actuality 3 different kinds of humans in a division that is known as the tripartition of mankind. The first type of human is what is known as the hylic man, or the soma-bodied man, a human who is strictly material in nature, as they are utterly bound to matter, are born from matter, and will perish in matter. In essence, a human being born without a soul. As we continue, keep in mind this soulless, material man, and how such a human could be equated to a psychopath, as such a soulless vessel lacks the spiritual resonance needed to interface with the feminine-based energies of the heart. The second type of human is the psychic man, who may, to a degree, determine their own destiny. Such a human could be described as a matter-dwelling spirit, as anything that is of spirit is closer to the divine, for such a human has a personal presence in the 4th density. The third category of human is the pneumatic man, with pneuma meaning divine breath. The pneumatic man is a spiritual human being who is pure and of the ineffable spirit. A human who physically incarnates to live a life of witnessing, only then to physically die and immediately return to the original source of creation itself. The tripartite tractate states, quote, "Each of the 3 types was known by its fruit, and they were not known at first, but only at the coming of the Savior, who shone upon the saints and revealed what each was." Unquote. We further this idea by citing the Nag Hammadi Library's tractate on the origin of the world, which states, quote, "For everyone must go to the place from which he has come. Indeed, by his acts and his knowledge, each person will make his own nature known." Unquote. There are indeed beings of the soil, beings of the higher mind, and beings of the ineffable spirit. In this model, have not the ruling class indeed made their nature known as lower beings of the soil? We can perhaps more definitively answer such a question by exploring the macro-creation of the world in itself. We approach the creation of this physical world by examining the mystical philosophy of the Gnostic scholar Valentinus, who postulated the existence of an utmost primal creator being, referring to this being as Bythos. As the initial source of all creation itself, Bythos emanated himself outward into 30 divine creator beings known as aeons, who were each instilled with their own free will and gathered into 15 complementary pairs of male and female, with each divine union known as a syzygy. A lower creator aeon known as Sophia, lower only in her approximation to the original source, decided to create a being without the male counterpart of her syzygy, a being that was instilled with the divine blueprint of original creation, but was nonetheless erroneously created in disharmony and subject to entropy, as such a creation lacked the divine harmony of male and female unity. This fractured creation was a male being known as the demiurge. There are competing Gnostic theories as to why Sophia decided to create the demiurge in a manner independent of her harmonic syzygy, with some philosophies suggesting that Sophia's passion overcame her as she tried to knowingly create beyond what she was capable. Others contest that her mistake originated from a higher erroneous source by an aeon that then filtered down to Sophia. Nevertheless, when Sophia created the demiurge and subsequently considered the consequences of her willful creation, her self-reflective thought, or epinoia, instantly transformed into the likeness of a lion-faced serpent, and its eyes became like flashes of fire and lightning. In other words, she immediately saw the error of her ways and cast the demiurge into the outer realms of space so that none of her fellow aeons would see what she had done. She had created the demiurge in ignorance and knew what she had created was an error. She tried to conceal him by surrounding him with a luminous cloud, and gave the demiurge his own dominion, or in other words, his own ability to create within that luminous cloud, so that he might keep to himself and never be seen from again. She then called the demiurge Yaldabaoth, Samael, or Saturn, who then used his gifted ability to create this physical world, including the physical bodies of the humans who dwell herein. And so, according to this creational story, it is not God who made our material world, but one of his lower minions. Moreover, this minion erroneously created our world in fractured imbalance, a worldly creation and all the material things that reside herein, by using the original blueprint of creation, but lacking the divine feminine essence, which essentially is an exact representation of the aforementioned nature of the psychopath. This demiurge is the first archon and utmost archon, who then, in ignorant darkness, divided himself out into lower and lower emanations that represent the different malevolent ultra-terrestrial personalities that stalk, haunt, and prey upon humanity from the fourth density realm, that, as previously elucidated, interface perfectly with the male imbalanced consciousness emanated by the genetic psychopaths of this physical realm, as such soulless humans are the soul creations of the demiurge himself. Sophia saw the wickedness of what her creation had led to, and overcome with sorrow, she descended into darkness. In this darkness she repented and began to weep. The whole of the pleroma, or aeonic realm where the aeons dwell, heard the prayer of her repentance, and they praised on her behalf the original virgin spirit. Her male consort came to her aid down through the pleroma, in order that he might correct her deficiency, and lifted her up from the darkness, yet not back to the pleroma, but just above her creation, in proximity to the mistake she made, so that she might correct her deficiency. And it is her repented essence, rejuvenated by the aid of the male counterpart of her syzygy, that resides as a spiritual presence among the material forms of this earth, emanating forth to spiritually ensoul a portion of humanity, forming the second type of humans, psychic man, who may to a point control their own spiritual destiny. The pneumatic humans are sent forth, as previously stated, to bear witness and then return to source, with certain divine avatars intermittently incarnated to help the spiritual ascendancy of human beings. According to the story, to once again relate such to our primary subject, it is those soulless, material human beings who represent primary psychopaths, as they are the sole creation of the demiurge, and are not instilled with the feminine essence of the virginal spirit. We have explored how these psychopaths can commune and interface with the malevolent consciousness of the fourth density, and how the psychopathic elite are used to further this consciousness's dark agenda by ruling over a constructed social hierarchy in order to manufacture low human consciousness to stave off the entropy that such malevolent consciousness is forever subject to in the fourth density realm. This metaphysical explanation does not rule out other intervention theories of human origins, however, as such could simply be a spiritual narrative for what also physically took place. The creation story of ancient Sumer, with that of the Anunnaki, and their genetic manipulation of human DNA could very well be the physical narrative that played out in such a scenario. The archaeological evidence for such, for instance in the infamous elongated and extra voluminous skulls, as well as the ruling class's obvious mimicry of Sumerian artistic depictions of the gods, including their attire, symbolic archetypes, and rituals, lends credence to the veracity of such a story I will nonetheless leave to other researchers, however. Whatever the nature of humanity's origin, as well as the origin of the psychopathic ruling class, such represents information that can only be transmuted into gnosis on a personal level. For once again, any information in of itself is neutral in value. Information assessed in a critical and intuitive manner becomes knowledge. Knowledge, deeply absorbed and engaged through spiritual insight, becomes wisdom, and the application of this wisdom through a direct, living contact becomes gnosis. Information has simply been provided here to initiate such further explorations in the formulation of one's own holistic analysis of psychopathy, and how this disease of wickedness has came to so readily influence the affairs of this world. Personally, I have directly applied all the information expressed in this presentation to my life, not by believing in such, but by simply holding this information as an idea through time. I have indeed found credence in the ideas put forth, particularly in the tripartition of man and the Gnostic creational myth on the origin of the world. Linking the material, soma-bodied man to psychopathy makes a great deal of sense and feels accurate, as such a soulless being can account for the heartless behavior of the psychopath and their ongoing subjugation of the human species. Viewed from an imbalanced perspective, such information could perhaps seem gloomily disempowering, yet viewed holistically, such becomes the opposite and is indeed quite uplifting. The implications of such a reality actually reveal how truly powerful human beings indeed are, as we have the ability to create our own reality, so long as we harmonize our heart and mind and choose to exercise our own precious, divinely bestowed gift of free will. The biggest secret of the control system is that it requires the willful input of our consciousness to function. By withdrawing our consciousness, and more importantly, withdrawing our consent, the control system falters. As previously stated, mapping negative polarity and illuminating shadow are nonetheless crucially important ventures of the ascendant human journey. It is through our contact with the extreme polarities of earthly living that inspires the evolution of our consciousness. Once we deconstruct the false parameters that have from birth been built around us, we naturally expose ourselves to greater possibilities, revealing the in fact infinite creative potential inherent to each of us. For instilled within every naturally evolving human being is a seed of divine potential, and it is only through personal acts of individual will that each seed can be germinated and fully nourished to bear the fruits of higher, holistic consciousness.